I wasn't supposed to be in that room. The infirmary at the prison had strict rules, especially when it came to high-profile inmates. But that night, when I was called in for an emergency shift, no one told me who was behind the locked door in the isolated wing. All I knew was that the guards outside looked tense, their hands resting a little too close to their holsters. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Hospitals and infirmaries always carried a mix of antiseptic and sickness, but this was different. It was sharp, chemical, like burned plastic mixed with something metallic. Then, I saw him. Diddy was lying on the cot, barely conscious, sweat slicking his skin despite the chill in the room. His wrists were bruised, his breathing ragged. I had seen withdrawal before, but this was something else. His pulse was erratic, his pupils blown wide, his fingers twitching like he was trying to grab onto something. I reached for the chart at the end of the bed, but there was nothing. No diagnosis, no medications listed, nothing to explain why a world-famous mogul was lying in a prison infirmary, looking like he was on the verge of death. The only thing in the room besides him was an IV bag, half drained of a thick, amber-colored fluid. That's when he grabbed my wrist. His grip was weak, but desperate. His lips moved, but his voice was barely above a whisper. I leaned in, expecting to hear the usual ramblings of someone in withdrawal, pleas for more meds, delusions, paranoia. But what he said made my stomach drop. They did something to me. I pulled away, my pulse hammering. Who? I asked, but his eyes flickered shut, his body convulsing for a brief second before going eerily still. I turned to call for help, but the moment I reached the door, it swung open. 2 men in suits stepped inside. Men who did not work for the prison. They weren't guards, they weren't doctors, they didn't introduce themselves. "You can leave now," one of them said, his voice low and even. I started, but the other man took a step forward, his stare sharp, unwavering. Now. I glanced back at the bed. Diddy's chest was still rising and falling, but barely. He needed medical attention, real medical attention. But when I turned back, one of the men was already pulling the IV from his arm, replacing it with another bag. One filled with the dark, viscous liquid I had never seen before. Something about the way they moved, the efficiency of it, sent a cold wave of fear through me. This wasn't medical care. This was something else. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding as the door shut in my face. The guards who had been standing outside were gone. The hallway, once buzzing with the usual sounds of the prison, was silent. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my hands. But the second I turned the corner, another man was waiting for me. He wasn't a guard. He wasn't a nurse. He wasn't wearing a badge. "Forget what you saw," he said. His tone was casual, but there was nothing casual about the way he looked at me. I opened my mouth to argue, to say something, anything, but then he leaned in, close enough that I could smell the faint trace of cologne beneath the sterile scent of the infirmary. "You don't want to know how this ends." And just like that, he was gone. I finished my shift in a daze, my mind racing with questions I knew I would never get answers to. When I checked the infirmary records the next day, there was no mention of Diddy ever being admitted. No charts, no reports, no sign that he had ever been in that room. It was like he had never been there at all. But I know what I saw. And I know, somewhere out there, he does too. I tried to push it out of my mind, pretend that it was just another strange night in a place filled with secrets, but the feeling lingered, that creeping sensation that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. Then, 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of someone outside my apartment door. It was past 3 a.m. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the residual paranoia from that night still messing with my head. But then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps, someone pacing just beyond the door. My heart pounded as I crept toward the peephole. The hallway light flickered, casting long, warped shadows, but I could make out the shape of a man standing just outside my door. He wasn't knocking. He wasn't moving toward the handle. He was just waiting. I held my breath, hoping, praying. Then my phone vibrated on my nightstand. I rushed back and snatched it up, my fingers shaking as I read the message from an unknown number. "Don't answer the door." I spun back around. The pacing had stopped. I couldn't see through the peephole anymore. Whoever was standing there had covered it. My throat went dry. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? That I had seen something I wasn't supposed to? That someone was outside my door because of it? That wouldn't go anywhere. Another message came through. Leave town tonight. I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, but I knew one thing. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my bag, stuffing it with whatever I could find. My keys, my wallet, my work ID, anything I could grab in under a minute. I hesitated at the door, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. I cracked it open just an inch. The hallway was empty, but I knew. Someone had been there. I hurried to my car, my nerves fried, scanning the parking lot for anything, anyone, out of place. The streets were quiet, but something felt off, like I was being watched. I pulled out of the lot, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My plan was simple: drive somewhere, anywhere, put distance between me and whatever was happening. But as I merged onto the highway, my phone vibrated again. One more message. Too late. A pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, bright and unblinking. The car behind me sped up, closing the distance within seconds. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the driver, one of the men from the infirmary. His face was calm, expressionless. I slammed the gas pedal, but the car behind me matched my speed. A sickening realization hit me. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was something else. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew one thing. I was never supposed to leave that room alive. I swerved off the highway, my tires screeching as I took an exit that led into a winding road through dense trees. The car behind me stayed right on my tail, its headlights glaring in the rearview mirror like an unblinking predator. Panic gripped my chest, tightening with every breath. My mind raced, but I couldn't think straight. I glanced at the GPS, trying to find any familiar place. But there was nothing. The road ahead was dark, isolated. No houses, no cars, just trees on either side. I was losing control, my hands trembling, the car swerving in and out of the lines. And then, out of nowhere, a loud bang! I jerked forward, my heart skipping a beat. Something had hit my car, probably a rock, maybe a piece of debris from the road. My tire began to hiss, the sound of air rapidly escaping. I cursed under my breath, trying to steer it back under control. But it was no use. The car swerved again, and I heard the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against the pavement. I slammed on the brakes, pulling the wheel to the right, and my car skidded to a halt. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service, no backup. Before I even had a chance to gather myself, the headlights of the other car blazed behind me, stopping just a few feet away. The engine hummed, but there was no sound of anyone getting out. The car was just parked, its lights reflecting off the trees and illuminating the darkness. I sat there, frozen. I could feel the weight of the moment, like someone had just hit the pause button on my life. I didn't know if I should run or stay still. I reached for the door handle, but my fingers wouldn't move. Every instinct told me to stay quiet, stay hidden, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. Then the car door opened. I saw him, one of the men from Diddy's mansion. His face was calm, too calm, as though he had no fear of me. He walked toward me, slow, deliberate steps that echoed in the dead silence of the night. I could see the outline of his figure growing larger, his dark suit blending with the shadows. My breath hitched. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It was like my body had gone into some kind of shock. "Get out," he said. His voice was low, controlled. I shook my head. My hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't open the door. "You have two options," he continued, leaning closer. "You get out and you walk away, or you get out and you'll never walk again." I looked up at him, seeing the emptiness in his eyes. He wasn't bluffing. This was real. My brain screamed at me to escape, but my legs felt paralyzed. The only sound I could hear was my own frantic heartbeat. In a panic, I unlocked the door and shoved it open. I stumbled out of the car, falling onto the cold pavement. I didn't dare look back. I just ran. The gravel crunched beneath my feet as I sprinted down the dark, desolate road. My mind blank except for one thing: run. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. I just knew I couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until I was far away from whatever was happening. I looked back over my shoulder and saw the other car still parked there, headlights casting long, eerie shadows. But I kept running, faster, harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, just when I thought I might make it to safety, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, heavy, purposeful, and growing closer. I forced myself to run faster, pushing every ounce of energy into my legs, but it was too late. I felt something cold, something sharp, grabbed me from behind. My body jerked back and I was pulled into the darkness. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed up by the emptiness. When I woke up, I was back in the mansion, Diddy's mansion. The cold metal of a table beneath me, the sterile smell of bleach in the air, and a single dim light above me. I could barely move. My wrists were tied down. Panic surged in my chest. Then I saw him again, the man who had chased me. He stood in front of me, calm as ever, as if nothing had happened. "You're awake," he said. His voice had no emotion. "You should have known better than to leave." "Why? Why are you doing this?" I could barely get the words out. He stared at me, expressionless. "Because you've seen too much." And with that, everything went black. When I woke up again, I was in a completely different room, the lights flickering above me. I could hear faint voices, but I couldn't make out the words. Something in my gut told me I wasn't the only one who had been caught in this trap. The door creaked open, and I braced myself. But it wasn't him, it was a woman. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and frantic. She took one look at me, and her eyes filled with terror. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered. "None of us are." And then, before I could ask what she meant, the door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the darkness again. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing louder. Whoever was outside, they weren't done yet. The game wasn't over, and that's when I realized I might never leave this place. Not alive, not whole. The door clicked open again, but this time I didn't move. I didn't want to see what came next, but the feeling of being watched never left.